You know, you raise your hand in a classroom and suddenly you have the floor.
Right.
But then you raise that exact same hand in a courtroom and you're swearing a legally binding oath.
Yeah, the context completely shifts.
Exactly. I mean, mechanically, it's just muscles and bones doing the exact same motion. It's just a lever moving on a hinge. But the situation completely changes the weight of the action. And, well, today's source material takes that sort of physical anomaly and applies it directly to the mechanics of modern Pentecostal worship.
Yeah, we are deconstructing one specific, really highly loaded gesture today, which is lifting your hands in a sanctuary. Because humans are, at our core, meaning-making machines, you know.
Oh, absolutely.
We take a really simple kinetic action and we just layer it with immense sociological, psychological, and obviously, in this case, spiritual significance.
Right. And our guide for this deep dive is a sermon delivered on July 12th, 2026 by Bishop Jerry Harper. It's titled The Power of Lifting Up Your Hands to the Lord. And the mission for us here is to kind of figure out how this one physical movement manages to communicate like surrender and warfare and community support all at the exact same time.
It's a lot of weight for one gesture.
It really is. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because before the bishop even gets to the actual physical gesture itself, he has to establish why believers need to operate differently in the world to begin with.
Right. He sets a baseline.
Yeah. He starts with this massive contrast between what worship should be and what it, you know, often actually ends up being.
And he begins with this really evocative sensory metaphor, which I found fascinating. He describes reading a historical account about a factory in northern France.
Oh, the lavender factory.
Exactly, a factory that produced lavender for perfumes. And he says at the end of a long shift, the workers would leave the factory and just walk home through the cobblestone streets of their little village.
The imagery he uses there is just fantastic because he says the sweet aroma of the lavender would cling so heavily to their clothes that just their mere presence, you know, walking down the street, it would perfume the entire town.
Right. And he connects that specific visual directly to a passage in the New Testament. It's 2 Corinthians 2.14-16, specifically in the Phillips translation.
Okay.
Because that text talks about spreading the knowledge of Christ throughout the world like a lovely perfume. So the bishop is laying this foundation early on, right? The idea is that believers are supposed to sort of bask in the aroma of God's presence during collective worship.
And then physically carry it out with them.
Yes, carry that sweet fragrance into every mundane, everyday interaction they have during the week.
And to ground this in reality, he shares this incredible story from his own life. Back in the last century, during his Bible college days, he was working at a department store called Zayre's.
Which I love that he pronounces it both Zers and Zars interchangeably in the audio.
I noticed that too. Zars. But anyway, he's like 18 or 19 years old at the time. He's third in command of the whole store, and it is the absolute peak of the chaotic Christmas rush.
I mean, just picture the sensory overload of that environment.
Oh, yeah.
He's managing something like 15 backed up cash registers. The stress levels in that room are just palpable. You know, the customers are frustrated. The staff is overwhelmed.
Totally. And right after the rush finally settles down a bit, a woman approaches him and asks him a very simple question. She just says, "Why do you smile all the time?"
Right.
And his response was just 5 words. He says, "I've got the Holy Ghost." And according to the sermon, 6 weeks later, that woman and her entire family were baptized.
It's a striking anecdote because look at how he defines the aroma of action there. The fragrance wasn't, you know, some loud, aggressive theological proclamation over the store intercom.
Right, he didn't preach a sermon at the register.
Exactly. The fragrance was a visible, consistent demeanor, just maintaining a genuine smile in a highly stressful, chaotic situation that altered the atmosphere of the room. It was a state of being rather than a transaction.
And that word transaction, that is exactly where he sharply pivots to critique modern consumer Christianity.
Yeah, he doesn't hold back here.
He really doesn't. He pulls in research from George Barna, estimating that only like 3 to 4% of Christians actually tithe. And then he drops this incredibly jarring statistic.
By dog food stat.
Yes. That people spend more money on dog food than they do giving to the kingdom of God.
It's such a calculated juxtaposition, right? Dog food and the divine kingdom. He's using that data to diagnose a really specific cultural sickness within the church.
Yeah.
He argues that a lot of congregants treat God like a Well, he calls it a magic genie in a bottle.
Yeah.
Like they believe if they just pray the exact right words, they get their 3 wishes granted.
Or they view God as a vending machine. And I see a massive parallel here to our modern, highly transactional culture.
How?
Well, think about it. We are entirely conditioned to expect an immediate ROI, right? A return on investment for every single action we take. I put $1 into the machine, I get a soda. I put an hour of work into my job, I get a paycheck.
We want the exact output for our input.
Exactly. And we take that identical framework and just map it onto the metaphysical. I put in a prayer, I get a blessing. But that vending machine mindset fundamentally clashes with the bishop's idea of simply, being a fragrance. Because a fragrance doesn't negotiate for a return on investment.
Right. It just exists.
It just is.
And that's the core theological argument he's making.
Yeah.
Believers do not exist to extract resources from the divine. They exist to reflect the divine, regardless of whether their external circumstances are favorable, like the lavender village, or chaotic, like the Christmas rush at Zayre's.
So, okay, if worship isn't supposed to be this transactional vending machine experience where we just push a button for a blessing, what is the correct physical expression of this faith? Like, how are you actually supposed to use your body in a sanctuary?
Well, this is where the bishop introduces the core theme of lifting hands. And he does it by grounding it in a completely secular, universally understood communal action. He actually compares lifting hands in church to doing the wave at a sporting event.
A stadium wave, like tens of thousands of people standing up, throwing their arms in the air in perfect sequence.
Exactly.
He suggests that doing this in church is a way to shake off the spiritual cobwebs, to get out of a rut, just to loosen up.
Yeah.
He even jokes that he's a real fan of God's team.
Which is brilliant because he's tapping into a well-documented sociological phenomenon known as collective effervescence.
Collective effervescence.
Yeah, it's this idea that when a large group of people engage in a synchronized physical action, the boundary between the individual and the group just kind of dissolves. Yeah. You feel this sudden euphoric sense of belonging.
Wow, okay.
And the bishop anchors this human need for physical synchronization historically. He traces it all the way back to Leviticus 7.30, which details waving and offering before God.
Oh, I see.
He also pulls from Psalms, specifically 63, 134, 141, and 119, where King David repeatedly frames lifting hands in the sanctuary as an evening sacrifice to bless the Lord.
But here's where it gets really interesting for me, and honestly a bit jarring, because he transitions right from that joyful communal energy of doing the wave to this stark, terrifying metaphor.
The gun metaphor.
Yes. He explains that the first primary meaning of lifting hands is surrender. And to illustrate this, he says, if someone sticks a gun in your face, what do? You lift your hands. It is the universal sign of submission.
Right. The physical message is, I have no weapons. I will do whatever you say.
And I really struggled with the friction between those two images while listening, because in one breath, lifting your hands is this spontaneous, euphoric joy of a stadium wave. And in the very next breath, it is the terrifying, involuntary surrender of having a lethal weapon pointed at your head.
It's a huge contrast.
How are we supposed to reconcile those two extremes existing in a single physical gesture?
Well, it's actually that tension between those two extremes that serves as the psychological engine of this specific type of worship.
What do you mean?
The gun in the face metaphor represents total ego death. Now, in a natural world, that kind of surrender is involuntary, right? It induces panic.
Obviously.
But in the sanctuary, it becomes an act of willing ego death. You are voluntarily stripping away your illusion of control, your pride, your self-sufficiency.
Ah, and he links that specific feeling of surrender to Psalm 63, right? Where David is crying out to God from a dry, desolate, thirsty wilderness.
Yeah.
He's feeling completely isolated and desperate.
Exactly. When you are in that desolate psychological wilderness, raising your hands is a physical manifestation of saying, I am at the end of myself. It's a desperate, thirsty submission.
Yeah.
But here is where the paradox resolves itself. That total destruction of the ego is the exact prerequisite for experiencing the collective effervescence of the wave that we talked about earlier.
Oh, wow.
You cannot truly merge with the joy of the community if you're still fiercely clinging to your own individual pride. The surrender is what actually causes the joy.
That makes so much sense. But, total individual surrender has a breaking point. Human biology eventually gives out.
Right. Muscle fatigue.
Exactly. You cannot physically keep your hands above your head forever. Gravity and muscle fatigue are always going to win. And that biological limitation is where the bishop pivots to the second primary meaning of lifting hands, which is strength and declaring battle.
Yes. Because in this theological framework, surrendering to God doesn't mean rolling over in passive defeat. It is a pivot into active warfare against a spiritual enemy.
And he illustrates this using one of the most vivid visual narratives from the Old Testament, from Exodus 17.
Right, the Amalekites.
Yeah, so the Israelites, led by Joshua down on the battlefield in the valley, they're fighting their archenemy, the Amalekites. Meanwhile, Moses goes up to the top of a hill overlooking the battle.
And the dynamic described in that text is entirely physical and directly causal. Because as long as Moses held his hands up to heaven, the Israelites were winning the physical battle below.
It's literally tied to his body.
Exactly. The moment fatigue set in and he lowered his hands, the Amalekites gained the upper hand. So the physical posture of the leader dictated the survival of the entire community.
So Moses is up there, he's exhausted, his arms are shaking. They end up finding a rock and they sit him down. And then two men, Aaron and Hur, they stand on either side of him and physically hold his arms up toward the sky.
They bear the weight for him.
Right, because they bear that physical weight for him, keeping his hands raised. The Israelites win the battle.
And the bishop makes a really profound sociological application here. He takes this ancient epic narrative of warfare and he applies it directly to the ordinary person sitting in the pew on a Sunday morning.
Right, he tells the congregation that in the heat of life's battles, your hands get tired, which is totally relatable. But then he takes it a step further, and this is where I actually need you to help me understand the implications.
Sure.
He tells the church that their local leader, Pastor Jared, will only achieve victory if the congregation raises his hands on each side. He essentially shifts this gesture from being a private, solo act of personal devotion into a structural, load-bearing pillar for the entire community.
Yes, he completely recontextualizes it.
So what does this all actually mean for you as the listener? Like, is he really saying that if my arms get tired and I drop my hands, my neighbor loses their battle?
Well, from a sociological standpoint, framing the gesture this way is just a brilliant mechanism for ensuring community survival.
Oh, so.
Because when a group redefines a solitary personal act as a shared necessity, it creates this unbreakable bond. Your personal worship is no longer just about your own emotional catharsis,
Right, it's bigger than you.
It becomes a civic duty. You are now responsible for the emotional and spiritual load of the person sitting next to you.
It totally eliminates the option of being a passive consumer.
Precisely. Because if you view the church as a vending machine, like we discussed, you just sit there waiting for your blessing.
Put your quarter in, wait for the soda.
Right. But if you view the church as a battlefield where Aaron and Hur are required for actual survival, well, you are compelled to actively participate. You're called to be the person who doesn't criticize the tired leader, but actually steps up to physically and emotionally hold their arms in the air.
That is a massive amount of communal responsibility to put on someone's shoulders.
It really is.
And right after establishing that this is a shared battle, the bishop specifically calls out a very particular demographic in the room to take the lead in this physical gesture.
The men.
Yes, he references the Apostle Paul in 1 Timothy 2:8, which urges, quote, men everywhere to lift holy hands.
Right. And he actually pauses the momentum of the sermon to explicitly praise the men in the congregation. He points out that it's a rarity in modern religious culture to have as many men in attendance as women.
Yeah.
And he issues this direct challenge to the fathers and husbands to lead the physical worship.
He literally tells them, he says, don't let your wives out-worship you. Don't let your children out-worship you. And he emphasizes that there is something uniquely powerful when, and this is a, quote, great big man lifts his hands in surrender.
Right.
Now, this gender dynamic is fascinating to me. Why focus so heavily on the physical size of the man, like a great big man?
Because he's deliberately subverting the traditional expectations of masculinity here.
Okay, unpack that for me.
Well, in a lot of Western cultures, male stoicism equates to strength. The expectation is that a great big man keeps his hands down, he stays quiet, he internalizes his struggles, and he hides his emotions.
That's right, the strong, silent type.
Exactly. Vulnerability is culturally coded as weakness for men.
So by demanding that the biggest, toughest men in the room throw their hands in the air, which again is the universal sign of absolute surrender and submission, he's completely inverting the cultural script.
Yes. He's asking them to be physically and publicly vulnerable, and he's arguing that this public ego death is actually the ultimate demonstration of male leadership.
Wow, it really shatters that stoic facade.
It does. And this subversion leads perfectly into its ultimate point. because the physical vulnerability of lifting your hands is completely empty. I mean, it's literally just muscles and bones moving if it isn't matched by a deep internal vulnerability.
The internal heart.
Yes.
He pulls a verse from Lamentations chapter 3 for this, though it's worth noting he actually mistakenly says Lamentations chapter 4 in the audio, but the text is, "Let us lift up our heart with our hands unto God in the heavens."
Lift up your heart with your hands. That one phrase synthesizes the entire theology of the sermon, really. The mechanical gesture of the hands is merely the external shadow of the internal posture of the heart.
And he concludes the sermon with this incredibly poignant, tender piece of imagery, which is wild because after spending, 20 minutes talking about heavy communal burdens and ancient battlefields and guns and faces, he softens the tone entirely.
It's a really beautiful shift.
It really is. He talks about children, specifically his own grandchildren, running up to him. And, to a small child, a grandfather is a giant. He is Papa.
Right.
And what does the child do? They reach their little, vulnerable, empty hands high up in the air.
And as a parent or a grandparent, you are biologically wired to respond to that gesture. You just cannot resist it.
Yeah.
You reach down, you pick up that child, you hold them close to your chest, and as the bishop puts it, you give them half the kingdom.
I love that. Half the kingdom. And he maps that exact dynamic onto the congregation. He tells them that when you lift your hands in the sanctuary, no matter how old you are, no matter how much of a great, big, tough man you think you are simply that vulnerable child reaching up to a heavenly Father. And that Father will reach down, pick you up, and say, "I am here for you." It just fundamentally shifts the gesture from a desperate act of wartime survival into an act of intimate familial trust.
It really brings the entire discourse full circle. It perfectly resolves that tension we were talking about earlier between the terror of surrender and the joy of the community.
Think about what this means for you as a listener, right? Even if you have never set foot inside a Pentecostal church.
Exactly.
This deep dive matters because it is a masterclass in how communities build shared meaning. It demonstrates how a single, seemingly simple physical movement, just raising your arms above your head, it functions as this incredibly complex language.
It's multi-layered.
It is. In one singular gesture, you are communicating the destruction of your own ego, an active declaration of spiritual warfare, a commitment to bear the structural load of your community, and a deep, childlike emotional vulnerability all at once.
It really reveals how human beings encode their most profound psychological needs into physical rituals. And, viewing it through that lens raises a really fascinating scientific concept that wasn't actually mentioned in the sermon itself, but it runs perfectly parallel to everything the bishop preached.
Oh, really? What's that?
Well, in modern psychology, there is a field of study known as embodied cognition.
Embodied cognition. Okay, so this is the idea that our physical postures don't merely reflect our internal emotional states, they actually have the power to create them, right?
Exactly. The classic example is that forcing your facial muscles into a smile can literally trigger the release of neurotransmitters in your brain that actually make you feel happier. The physical action precedes the emotion.
That is fascinating. So the body leads the brain.
Yes, our minds and our bodies are not separate silos. They exist in this constant bidirectional feedback loop. Your brain looks to your body to understand how it should feel. Which leaves us with a really profound question to consider here. Might the ancient biblical mandate to lift one's hands be an early, intuitive understanding of this exact psychological mechanism?
Oh, man.
Right. Is it possible that throwing your hands up in a posture of complete surrender and total victory actually triggers your brain to physically experience relief and strength in the middle of a chaotic, stressful environment?
That is an incredible thought to leave on. I mean, you start by just moving muscles and bones. You raise your hand in a classroom to be heard. You raise your hand in a courtroom to swear an oath. And maybe when you are exhausted in the wilderness and you raise your hands in the sanctuary, well, you aren't just signaling surrender. You are physically rewiring your own brain to survive the battle.
A powerful gesture indeed.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.